Hey, everybody. Welcome to Aaron's Audio Corner, where I review speakers and I give you information about them and talk about how flowery and wonderful they sound. And I also provide you with data so that way you don't think I'm just full of stuff and making things up as I go. All right. Hey, everybody, for real. This is Aaron, and I'm going to do a live review of the Fluid Audio Image 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some slides and some graphics and things like that. You may get to see some of the behind the scenes type stuff that I do. Normally, when I shoot these, I use the same slides. I film it and then I edit it down. But it's just kind of been like a rough week for me personally, just some stuff going on. And it's not like a, woe is me situation. It's just a rough week, very busy week and some other stuff going on. And I'll be honest with you, I just didn't really feel like editing a video today, and I really wanted to go ahead and get this review done because I've had these pair of speakers on loan for me by Fluid Audio for, I mean, it's probably been 6 months. And to those guys, I do apologize for it having taken this long. I got set back by some personal things, mainly just back issues. So here we are today, and I'll read you through some of the highlights real fast about these speakers. They are $3,800 a pair. They have very good low bass extension with an F3 at about 38 hertz and an F10 at about 32 or so hertz. So they get low in room without much issue at all. There are settings on the back that allow you to do some tweaking for treble, mid, and bass. So if you don't like the treble level itself, you can bump it up by 1 dB or down by 1 dB. Same thing for mid and same thing for low bass. And I'll show you a photo of the back shortly. The one thing that I really want to note about this particular speaker is that you have to be at ear level. Now, you see it over my shoulder here, and I've got it compared to a Coke can. It's a pretty large speaker. And let's see here. What do I got for these other notes? The tweeter is a 1-inch air motion transformer, according to the website. I'm just reading the specs off the website right now. Mid range is a 5.1-inch aluminum cone. And then there are two 8-inch woofers on the side. You can kind of see if I point. Is it over there? Yeah. Two 8-inch woofers, one on each side. That's what allows it to get down so low in frequency. And what I'm going to do now is I will show you some of the information that I'm talking about, or actually some of the photos. In this photo, what you see is on the left, the speaker's front and kind of the side of it. And you'll notice that the tweeter is below the mid range. You can actually take this faceplate and you can switch it out, flip it around, and put the tweeter above the mid range. But since this is how it was shipped to me, I went ahead and tested it in this way. Now, this will matter when I start talking about vertical directivity. I'll save it for then. And then we got a picture of the back of the speaker as well. You can see you've got analog input and digital input, USB, DSP for configuration, and there's a foot switch as well if you wanted to use that, which, foot switches aren't really my area of expertise, so I'll leave that to the pro audio mixing type channels who have already reviewed the speaker. I'm going to lean more toward the data. Okay. So let's jump into this as a higher zoomed in, I can't say resolution, but a more zoomed in view. So you've got the volume on the left, you've got low frequency attenuation on the right side. And then you've got the mid frequency and high frequency. You can change those by about plus or minus 1 decibel. And you've got a groundless switch, channel switch, input switch as well. And I'll close this and come back. What I want to talk about first is what I heard with the speaker. So my listening setup was done in the near field in my office at my computer using my Motu M2 sound card, I guess is what we would call it, feeding these speakers via the analog XLR output. And then my audio source was my iTunes library. So I've got all sorts of stuff on there from, I don't necessarily listen to high resolution, but what I'll say is it is good recordings. And if you've watched my video about what I listen to and what I listen for, I kind of go on a side tangent about how a lot of high resolution remasters, if you will, are really just bumped up versions of a later remaster. And really what happens is you wind up getting a worse sounding file than the original album. So I go out of my way for a lot of my favorite songs and favorite artists and favorite albums to source an original pressing from 1986, for example, or a Japanese pressing if I am shown that there is a actual tangible audible difference in the record. So, with that said, I listen to my own personal library through that, and then some iTunes stuff as well, or Apple Music stuff as well. I'll start things off with the cons of what I heard, or I'm sorry, we'll start off with the pros. We'll start off that way. The speakers have a linear response of about plus or minus 2.5 decibels, and it would actually be a little bit tighter if not for the treble. So I tested the speaker with the treble set at 0 decibels, and if I were trying to give it a better look in terms of the data, I would have switched it over to the plus one and reran it for the treble, but I didn't do that. And that's why I want to just test it, out of the box. Extremely low mid-range and a high frequency distortion. Very, very good numbers. Now, when you get to the low end below about maybe 70 or 60 hertz, it starts increasing more and more. We'll see that in the data shortly. Bass extension, as I said, is down to about 30 hertz, upper 20s, maybe lower 20s, mid to lower 20s in the room, depending on placement. All these things always matter. And these speakers have really good directivity. So let's see here. So what do I got for my cons? Well, let me get some water first. And I hope you guys are doing all right. I hope everyone had a good Halloween. And I know I did. I was invited to go hang out with my friend, and I picked up another friend on the way, and we passed out candy in his neighborhood, and it was a good time. It was cold. I live in North Alabama. I think the temperature was probably down into the upper 30s last night. It was really cold, but there were tons of kids trick or treating. We scared some of them. I got a Tesla, so I made my car fart at them via the horn honk, which is awesome. I'm such a child. I'm 41. For those of you who don't know, I'm 41. And I love doing childish things. So I'll just admit it. All right. Cons. These are large, as you can see, compared to this Coke can, this crushed Coke can. These speakers are pretty large. So putting them on a desktop, like in my situation, I don't have a photo to show you, but my desktop is kind of a standard desktop. It's an L shape, and they take up a ton of space. So I think that unless you have a lot of room on your desktop, then you may be better off putting these. I don't want to say you soffit mount them, because then you're going to have to use EQ to soffit mount these, drop down the bass area. So really, I guess what I'm trying to say is just make sure you have plenty of desktop space. You can find the dimensions on the website, see if they make sense for you in that regard, but they are kind of big. The high frequency was a little bit too low for my personal listening taste. Now, I'm about 1.5 feet on average, 1 to 1.5 feet away from these speakers, and I had to make sure that I put that tweeter right ear level, because if you don't, then the other con is as soon as you go more toward that woofer, then you get a pretty strong suck out between about 3 to 5 kilohertz, and that really impacts attack, decay, speech intelligibility. Percussive instruments don't quite sound right if you're not dead on axis with that tweeter. And even with that in mind, if you sit really far away, relatively speaking, so let's say you're in the far field of a meter or more, then you're going to also hear that as well. And I'll show you what I mean in the data shortly. Limiting for the near field is going to be okay. And when I say limiting, I mean compression. So it's going to tame the output of the woofer at higher volumes just to keep it from over exceeding excursion. In the near field, it's not really a problem. So you're not going to have an issue with dynamic range, in my opinion. But in the far field, say a meter or further out, that could be an issue. So just keep that in mind as well. Let's see here. Is a tad narrow in radiation. These speakers are about plus or minus 40 to 50 degrees on average, just kind of in that ballpark. And I say on average. So really the mid-range is about plus or minus maybe 60 degrees or so. But when you take over to the tweeter range, that's when they really narrow up. Personally speaking, I like a speaker that has a wider radiation in horizontal terms, because I like a little bit more room involvement. Now, with a near field speaker, Those kind of things don't matter quite as much. Room involvement doesn't really factor in quite as much when you're sitting, this far away from the speaker or this far away, because there's less things bouncing off the walls. You're more succumbed to the direct sound that's right in front of your face as opposed to all the reflected sound. Now, if you go further and further and further and further and further away from the speaker, then you start hearing a lot more reflected sound. And then that's when the horizontal radiation and the apparent source width, so the reflection off the side walls, that's when it starts to take a play or take a role into the soundstage width. But still, with that said, soundstage radiation or soundstage width also is due to the radiation. And certainly the music itself, but we're assuming that you already understand that soundstage is baked into the music, but the speaker can do things. It can restrict, or I won't say broaden, but it can allow it to go wider than other speakers. And I'll show you also what I mean when I say that as well. And they are, again, $3,800 a pair, $1,900 each. So now I'm going to flip over to this and I'm going to show you. I'm probably going to hide myself a little bit. There we go. As you can see, I'm showing you the on-axis response. Response linearity is about minus 2.18 to plus 2.35 based on the average level. And in this case, it's saying 95.6, but this is a powered speaker. So you can ignore the mean SPL here. It's just kind of a number for a reference. But since it's a powered speaker, that could be pretty much anything from 70 decibels to 100 decibels, just depending on where I measured it at. In this case, at 1 meter, the equivalent volume is at 95.6. So just FYI. Now you can see as you go up into the upper frequency above about 2 kilohertz, right in this area, the tweeter level is dropped down some by about 1 decibel. Earlier, I said that I could have bumped this up on my own if I wanted to. I just didn't. If I'd had more time, well, I shouldn't say if I had more time. If I had realized the results showed this before I packaged the other speaker up, then I probably would have maybe gone back and remeasured it. But I've already started measuring other speakers. And to be honest, I just didn't want to go back and remeasure this one for that little setting because that's not how it comes out of the box. And I think it makes more sense to show you what it comes in out of the box and just say, if you want to, bump this up by 1 decibel if you find it to be too low in level, like I personally did. F3 is at 38 hertz, F10 is at 32 hertz. So what this means is it will get down into the 30 hertz region without issue in a room. Now, if you try to get it down into the 20 hertz region, you're really going to need a lot of help from the room. And really what that means is you're going to have to hope actually that there's a strong room mode somewhere between 25 to 30 hertz if you want to do that, because the rate of roll off of this particular speaker is so steep that getting into 20 hertz just because you put it into a room and just because you put it somewhat near a wall isn't as likely as maybe something like a standard ported woofer or a standard sealed subwoofer, where the roll off is maybe going to be 12 dB per octave, a little bit more shallow for sealed, or 18 dB per octave, something like a typical ported woofer. So that's kind of it for this graphic. Let's go ahead and see what we got on the next one. All right, the CEA 2034 data. Get some more water. I'm getting parched, y'all. All right, the main thing that I want to take away from this, because we've already seen on-axis response, we have already seen listening window. Now we can look at sound power right here, but what I like to do is consider how EQable is the speaker, because if you're using it to mix and master, then I'm assuming that you have access to equalization. And you'll want to do some equalization maybe for your own needs, right? I mean, maybe you like a little bit of something here or there, or maybe you want to try to bring this little area down and smooth it out a little bit more, or maybe you want to extend the bass a little bit more, something like that. I'm assuming, again, that you have equalization. And if you do, how much more flat can you make this speaker? Where does it take well to equalization? Well, for the most part, it seems to take well to equalization pretty much everywhere, except between 1 to about 1.6 kilohertz. That doesn't seem to be due to the vertical radiation stepping between the tweeter and the midwoofer, because that actually looks like it might be in this particular area. Now, it's hard for me to say for sure. I do have the data. I would have to go pull something else up to know 100% sure, but I'm thinking that the tweeter crossover is somewhere in this 2 kilohertz area. I may be wrong, so you guys can fact check me on that. But in a nutshell, basically, this speaker can be equalized easily everywhere except for this particular 1 to 1.5 kilohertz area, give or take. I also wanted to note that this has pretty constant directivity from about maybe 2.5 kilohertz to about 10 kilohertz. And then it starts to increase a little bit more above 10 kilohertz. Now, that can be good, but it can also be bad. For a speaker that you're going to be listening to in the far field, when it's flat in the treble region as far as directivity index goes, meaning the radiation on axis and off axis is pretty much the same throughout, then that can create a bright sounding speaker or a treble heavy sounding speaker, assuming that the on axis in this black right here, on axis frequency response is flat ish. Now, the reason for that is because the direct sound that's flat is essentially flat-ish off axis as well. And it's treble dropping just a little bit, but the reflected sound is just reinforcing that direct sound. And it's going to make the speaker potentially sound bright compared to, and that's the key word here, compared to the mid-range, upper mid-range, mid-range, lower mid-range, mid-bass particular areas. And we can kind of get a hint for that if we go and look at the estimated in-room response. Now, you guys may remember earlier, I just told you that when I was listening to the speaker, it sounded like maybe there was some lack of percussive sound, attack, maybe dialogue clarity. I attribute that to this particular droop right through here between about 2.5 to about maybe 5 kilohertz or so. Now on the top end, it kind of flattens back out. Now keep in mind that this is more indicative of far field listening. So in the far field, about a meter or more, give or take, this is kind of the tonality that you're going to hear. So the mid range is going to sound mostly neutral, but then the upper mid range is going to sound like it's missing a little something by about 2 to 3 dB, depending on what frequency range you are talking about. But then we notice that in the upper range, it starts to pick back up. So depending on where you are sitting relative to the speaker, distance wise, the speaker could sound like it's missing this area, or it could sound more neutral like you have in the on axis response area. So I was sitting about 1.5 feet, give or take. And I think that if I were sitting a little bit closer, it probably would have sounded more close to this. But since I was sitting around 1.5 feet and then sometimes a little bit further, I think it was maybe sounding or starting to get some of this influence. Not quite as bad as this graphic shows, but starting to get some of that influence. So you really are going to want to pay attention to your seating distance. And again, you're also going to make sure you're on axis with that tweeter. Okay. Next graphic, horizontal polar. Now I've drawn some lines here. Radiation is wide, 60, 70 degrees below 2 kilohertz, but narrowing above 2 kilohertz. So we can see that the dark red to the orange is reasonably wide in the lower frequencies. But when you get to around 2 kilohertz, something's kind of going on there. There's some possibly diffraction issues. I'd have to go back and look at the other data. But basically what it is it's narrowing right through that region horizontally. And that also has to do with what we saw with some of the other estimated in-room response data. So if I go back to 2 to 5 kilohertz or so, so we see some of that in here as well, okay? Okay, now I'm going to look at the vertical. This is really what I want you to pay attention to. Notice I'm giving you this graphic right here again to show you that the tweeter is at the bottom, mid-range is at the top in this measurement condition, and that's how I listen to the speaker. So if my reference axis at 0 degrees is dead on axis with this tweeter, then if you go just a smidge, I'm talking 5 degrees above that tweeter line, maybe up here with your ears level with this region right here, then you're going to hear a suck out between about 3.5, maybe 3.2 to 5 kilohertz. Now that compounds this narrowing right through here, and then those two work to get you this in the far field, but they also work to get you that in the midfield as well. So you'll, again, I just really want to make sure that people understand what the data is showing you and how you can use that to better understand how to use the speakers, basically. Okay, so distortion to 86 decibels at 1 meter. This thing is super clean. It's below 1%. I don't even know what this is. Is this like 0.01%? I mean, super duper low down here. And then if I go to 96 decibels, it's still below 1%. Above 80 hertz, below 80 hertz, it starts to ramp up. We see some typical distortion ramping up like we would expect to get, but it's also worth noting that it's pretty much all second order, which indicates there's really good symmetry on these woofers as well. So that's a good thing. Multi-tone distortion at varying levels. So starting off at 70 dB, 79, I think 88, and then or 87, and then 96. So that's what each of these gray steps for. And then the 96 decibels is this green. So at max output, there is a little bit of a spike of distortion around maybe 1.4 kilohertz. Are you going to hear that? It's so narrow. I'm not really going to think that you're going to hear it, especially if you're sitting really close to the speakers, because you're not going to need to turn them up to 96 decibels at 1 meter. And then 96 for a meter and a pair is also quite loud. So now let's check out the compression. Compression is what I was talking about earlier about the limiting. And at this 86, 96 in the blue line, at 1 meter, 86 for one speaker at 1 meter is 92 decibels at 1 meter for a pair of speakers in a typical room. 92 decibels, okay? And then the same thing, 96 at 1 meter anechoic is the same thing as 102 decibels in a room for a pair of speakers at 1 meter. So this red and this blue line right here indicate the limiting / compression that this speaker would undergo as you're listening to it at different output volumes. And I would say from this alone, you're probably fine if you're in the near to midfield. Now, if you're in the far field, and let's say you're at like 3 meters away, or you're beyond a meter, so you're at 2 meters, something like that. Or maybe even 1 meter if you consider 1 meter far field for a pair of studio monitors. Then yeah, you're going to get some limiting. You're going to get less bass output below about 200 hertz, and it drops off the chart, literally off the chart. But is that a problem for most people who are going to be using the speaker? Probably not. I seriously doubt you're listening further than 3 feet away for most people. So I don't expect that limiting compression is really going to be an issue for you. And that really is the last graphic. Let me close my picture out here for the data. And just to kind of reinforce my thoughts on this speaker, it's a $3,800 per pair set of speakers. I like the dip switches on the back for changing what you want to change. The response is mostly neutral, except for that upper end. Bump it up 1 decibel is what I would recommend. But then again, when you put it in your home, maybe you'll like it where it is, or maybe you'll like it -1 dB on your desktop. You can do whatever you want to with it. I didn't feel the need to mess with any of the other switches, the low frequency switch or the mid-range switch at all. Distortion is extremely, extremely low, super smooth mid-range, no distortion whatsoever that was detectable by my ears at least. And even the data shows it's about 40 decibels down, even at 96 decibel output. So the distortion is pretty much a non-factor for this particular set of speakers, unless you're talking about the very low bass, in which case I would say you probably not really going to pick up on that too much anyway, unless you're listening to these speakers at extremely high levels. And I just don't think you're probably going to do that. That's just my personal take. Let's see here. So that really does it for my review. Let's see here. If I've got any comments. Homeboy, did I try the cube mix mode? I did not try that mode. I think high second order equals asymmetry. Also, it's a characteristic of passive radiator alignment. So that's good to know. I appreciate that. Although I thought high second order was symmetry, but you may be right. I can't recall now. Okay, somebody is correcting me there. It gives high third order. So good. I appreciate the correction there. Dispersion is not worth it. So that's up to you, right? I mean, personally, I like a wider dispersion speaker. Some people like a more narrow one. When you're sitting in the near field, it doesn't seem to matter quite as much, but I still find that I appreciate a speaker that has a little bit wider of a dispersion. So, let's see here. Aaron, will you be testing a new Purify 10-inch once you get your hands on one? If I get my hands on one, then yes. I don't know. It's not currently planned that I will, but that doesn't mean that I won't ever. And do I have any other questions about this particular thing? Oh, the vertical isn't, in my opinion. Yes, that's a very good point. Now, you got to make sure that you are on axis with that tweeter, because once you go above, or I should say, once you go toward that mid range, there's a pretty deep lobing effect there that really kind of seems to, it takes out the attack, and some people may consider that as dynamics as well. And I try to be careful when I use subjective terms for frequency response in regards to using the term dynamic. Dynamics to me is its own separate thing. How does the frequency response deviate as you change the volume? And that's what that one graphic, that's what this graphic is showing you. As I alter the volume from 76 decibels, which is the black line reference, to 86, 96, or 102 at 1 meter, and then this shows you the equivalent output meters over here in a room. What happens? That's what would happen. So that's your dynamics. But I can see where some people could say that if you sit slightly above the tweeter axis, then the speaker may not sound as dynamic. That would probably be why, in my opinion. So I think that does it for me. I appreciate you all watching and joining. I've got some other cool stuff coming at some point. I'm trying to stay on top of things, but I'm a little bit bogged down on some other stuff right now. So just, keep an eye out. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. If you're interested in supporting my channel, you can do so a number of ways. You can join me at patreon.com/Aaron's Audio Corner. You can use any of my generic affiliate links that are in the description below. You can use Amazon, Crutchfield, Audio Advice. I've just got a whole bunch of them in the comment section below. So check it out there if you want to, or you can hook me up with PayPal if you want to buy me a cup of coffee. I don't drink it, but Snickers bars are like $2.50, and I like Snickers bars, so those are cool. I appreciate you all again watching this, and I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.